Like Dave said, I'm kind of winging this, so I ask that everyone refrain from giving me suggestions, corrections, questions, or pronunciation suggestions, because I'll just send us down the garden path and I'll never get the program finished. I've got 196 slides, including that one, to get through in an hour. So we're going to kind of move this along. I call this the 4 big projects. A big project versus, there's other big projects too, but these are 4 of my big projects. A big project is one that's not done in one trip. And a lot of these weren't done in 100 trips, right? So more than 100 trips. The 4 big projects are the Boston and Albany, which is still ongoing. The Southern Pacific Donner Pass, which I haven't been to in a while. Irish Rail, which is still ongoing, and Conway Scenic, which is I just really started with. So we're going to look at each one of these, and that also spans from 1978 to about 3 days ago. So we'll have a nice span of time. So we're going to cover a lot. At the end, I will talk a little bit about the cameras. We use a lot of different type of cameras. I started with a Leica 3A that my dad, actually a 3C, but the first camera I had was a Leica 3A that my dad got me for, I think, my 10th birthday. I'd been using his 3C prior to that. And that's a 1930s era rangefinder German camera. And I did all the processing of the black and white film myself from about the age of 6, which I guess is kind of unusual. I did not know that was unusual. My mother showed me how to do it. The first 10 years were a bit rocky because I didn't take good notes. And after about 1985, the processing improved. I'd been using his 3C prior to that. And that's we've got like an echo rangefinder. What is going on? It's like a ghost. So we're going to start with the Boston and Albany. Photo was made Labor Day weekend, 1978, on the eve of my starting 7th grade. And that's with my dad's Leica 3A with had a winder. And you could take about 6 frames in rapid succession. You'd wind the camera up, and it was he called it a motorized camera, but it was really a wind-up camera. Unfortunately, I got a bit enthusiastic, so that was frame 6 in the sequence. The first 5 are a bit distant. And that's Amtrak's Lakeshore Limited, westbound, train 449 at Brookfield, Route 148. And the mill complex behind the train largely burned to the ground a number of years ago. So we'll start with the Boston and Albany. The program is largely chronological. There's a few exceptions, but I'm largely going from the oldest pictures to the newest ones. Within the segment, the program is largely chronological. There's a few exceptions, but I'm largely going from the oldest pictures to the newest ones. I don't know if that messes up the sound, but that's driving me crazy. So, my dad would take my brother and I out to watch the lakeshore go by. And so this was a photo taken almost 40 years ago near what's now CP 79 east of Palmer, Mass. Dave, that little speaker thing was talking back to me, so I put it outside, much to the amusement of everybody. But I realized it might be messing up the digital part of the thing. You can hear it yakking away out there.
Oh, I thought that was turned off. Oh.
Oh, it's still yakking away. So
Let me.
Getting a text from one of the watches saying it is feedback. It was feedback.
You know I'm enunciating the words.
You can't make this stuff up.
I've given a lot of programs. I've never had that happen.
I thought I turned it off.
Okay. So let's go back to the main thread here. So this was in 1982, August of 1982. There's Amtrak's 449 westbound, again, the Lakeshore Limited. And my dad here has got a very expensive Gitzo tripod with a JVC half-inch video camera, which was a project he was working on. We were just kind of experimenting. I didn't take as much interest in the video part of this, but I did take a lot of black and white stills. So this was kind of a regular thing when I was a teenager. From age about 6, I realized that I knew how to get cab rides. And I got really good at this. And one day, I was about 15 or so, it was before I could drive. My brother said, "Why don't I ever get to ride on an engine?" And I said, "Well, would you like to?" And he's like, "Yeah." And I go, "Okay, well, I got a couple of conditions. One, you don't tell anybody about this, ever, right? This is like, I'll get you a cab ride, we'll go do something, but you got to keep it to yourself." So anyway, we went to Palmer, we rode our bikes to Palmer, and there was a work train there, and it was really simple. I just talked to the engineer. I go, hi, my brother's never been on an engine before. So my brother took that picture. It's the only picture in the program that I did not expose. It was exposed with my Leica, and that's me leaning out of the cab of a B-23-7 in Palmer about 1982. I showed these pictures to my dad about 15 years. He's like, when did this happen? And I'm like, I don't know, the slide says, March 1982. The only thing that was unusual about this is that my brother was along. This happened a lot. Anyway, so December of 1983, Mass Central started running excursions on the Ware River branch. I have a long-standing relation with the Mass Central and the Ware River branch, so there's a lot of Mass Central in the Boston and Albany program. That's coming through Thorndike, Massachusetts on the 17th of December, 1983, again with the Leica. Now, I like to push the envelope a little bit. This is not actually properly Boston and Albany. It's actually on the former New Haven, but it's locomotives lined up for South Station, so it sort of fits in. I like it because it was taken with my dad's 21 millimeter. It was a 21 millimeter Super Angulon, which is actually a Schneider lens that Leica licensed, but I used to use this lens a lot. And it has this kind of polarized effect, a very wide angle lens. It's a lens that I made really good use of in the 1980s. We still have it. A big influence on my photography, especially with the Boston and Albany, was Bob Buck, who's standing there at the center. And there was a group that would meet at West Springfield Yard, largely retired railroaders or people from railroad families. We have Norval Parker on the left. His family all worked for the Boston and Albany largely out of Chester. So we'd go there on, I think it was Tuesday nights in the summertime, and the Conrail would be switching and we'd all be just telling stories. I wish I had spent more time photographing the guys and actually writing down what they were telling me. I remember a bit, but not enough. Anyway, the big influence there. Signaling was always something I was very interested in. One of my dad's close friends, the best man at his wedding, was in the chief signal engineer department at New York Central, later Penn Central, later Conrail. He gave us a tour of Grand Central when I was about 5 and gave me a 1937 updated to 1946 New York Central rule book, which was one of the first things I ever read. This is something I tell all the guys when I give a rules class at Conway Scenic. I've been doing this a while. Anyway, so here we have New York Central, classic New York Central, searchlight signaling on the Boston Albany, complete with grade plate. If you want the complete details on that, I've written 2 books on signaling. And again, I have remarkably few good color pictures of signals on the west end of the B&A because they started taking them down about 1986. But there's a nice picture with a caboose, telephoto lens at Middlefield looking eastbound towards the unusual signal. The Boston and Albany, like the Boston and Maine, displayed clear over clear or green over green for a clear signal. It took me years to find out why they did that, but I eventually got a signal engineer to explain it to me. What have I done wrong? And
You're doing fine.
we'll have to go. There's no time for that here.
You're doing
Night shots were a big part of this. Bob Buck and I would go to Springfield Station. He had tickets to the symphony, and about once every 2 or 3 months, he'd bring somebody else, sometimes his wife, sometimes a friend. And so sometimes I'd tag along. I liked the classical music, but then afterwards we'd go down to Springfield Station. I carried a Metz potato masher style flash that I had dressed up with all sorts of things to soften the light. And I'd run around Springfield at all hours of the night taking pictures. These things were not particularly popular. They weren't popular with the crews. They weren't popular with the passengers. I thought they were pretty cool. They were the seldom powered vehicles. They were built by Bud, SPV 2000s. They didn't last very long, not in service. People have been asking me a lot about this caboose. Somebody wants to build a model of it. So I've been searching for pictures of it. It was the New England Division caboose under Ernie Cross when he was division superintendent of the Boston and Albany. After he retired, it went out and became the Buffalo Division caboose. Anyway, it was kind of unusual. And that's at Springfield Station, passing the old dispatching office. Next. Okay, so South Station, Boston, a place that I have a lot of pictures over a very long period of time, most of them not very good. But this is kind of cool because they were running the Bud cars. I'm a big fan of the Bud cars. I like the SPVs too, but the Bud cars were cool. This was taken in January 1985. I was surprised that at that date we still had Bud cars and Alco RS3s working there, but apparently we did. The semaphores were a bit kind of not doing so well. Engine rides have always been a big part of all of this. I am very cautious about putting these pictures up since the gentleman who was running the engine has passed away and the railroad's gone and the diamond's gone and the locomotive is most likely scrapped. It's at Westfield. It was the local, the WNWS 2 or 5. It was one of those anyway. It's written on the back of the print. The engineer was Bob Foreman. He lived in Palmer. He was top of the roster for Conrail on the Boston Albany. Really good friend of mine. Did a lot of cab rides with him. I kind of lost touch with him in the late 80s, but he was a really, really good guy. And that's that picture in my most recent Conrail book. I dedicated the book to him with that photo. Just a really, really good engineer. I walked most of the Boston and Albany from Worcester to about CPSM. That's just east of the Castleton Bridge. At one point or another, all one day over a course of about 7 years. And at one point, I was out at State Line Tunnel. We camped out at State Line. That's a westbound freight approaching the east portal of one of the two tunnels. This is the tunnel that was abandoned in 1988. There's a stone arch bridge in West Warren, Massachusetts that has been the subject of many photos of mine. That's one of my favorite. It's a Conrail C32-8, an unusual type of locomotive on Kodachrome, crossing the bridge over the Quabog River at West Warren. Bob Buck always liked to say this is one of the Whistler's arches. And I didn't ever want to tell him that he was wrong. It's not. It was actually built long after Whistler was dead. It was built about 1873, but that's another story. This was a photo made October 20th, 1985. So I missed by a day, but we're getting close. This was yesterday's Track in the Light picture. So how many years is that? That's what, 36 years? Just over 36 years ago. Rolleiflex Model T, Verichrome pan, black and white film. And that's at the old helper facility at Chester. That's the NHSE, the New Haven to Selkirk freight. And at this point in time, the New Haven freight still carried cabooses, which was, of course, the attraction of the train. Conrail began running trains on the B&A without cabooses, I think it was April 1984. And there was a transitional period, but the cabooses started coming off at that time. I took very detailed notes, and this is the note page from October 20th, 1985. I shouldn't have been struggling with all the detail. There it is, everything you'd ever want to know. And there's even some detail from October 21st, 1985. I started this format 2 days earlier. I used to have like a loose leaf notebook with like 6 little pins, and then I switched to this open format, and I used that for a number of years. But I would write down all the particulars of whatever I knew or thought that I would need. The most important part about this is not just that I have the times and the train symbol, but I kept all my exposure notes, which is how I learned to take much better pictures. I noticed there was a dramatic improvement over the course of about a year because I kept all my exposure details. Now, today with digital cameras, you know right away how well or how poorly you did. Back in those days, it could be months from the time I released the shutter to the time I actually got around to processing the film. So if the picture came out good, I didn't know what I did right. If the picture came out poorly, I didn't know what I did wrong. So I started writing it all down. The pictures that were taken before, that is the entry in my notebook. So not only I know what locomotives were there, but I have all the exposure detail. Now, the thing that I unfortunately did not record was what kind of film I was using. I learned that real quick. You need to include that kind of detail too. I do know that I was using the Verichrome pan black and white because I still have the negatives. And I can just look at them and they tell you right on it what it is. Again, the Boston and Albany had a lot of curiosity. Do I need to talk this way?
Yeah, but this way you can face the audience.
Ah, okay. So in the 1980s, Conrail was implementing a lot of changes and things were changing very quickly. What we had here is at Huntington, there was a minor crossing, Huntington, Massachusetts, there was a minor crossing where there was a traffic light used to protect the crossing. And in 1985, they transitioned from a traffic light to a more traditional grade crossing flasher. I think this is unfortunate for 2 reasons. One, first of all, when the light went red, you knew there was a train coming. 2, motorists are actually more likely to stop at a traffic light than at a pair of flashers, as is repeated daily all across the country. So that was an unfortunate move for Conrail. Palmer, Massachusetts, I probably have more pictures in Palmer, Massachusetts than any other place except Dublin, Ireland. And I've been photographing Palmer pretty much since I could stand up. So there's a lot of pictures here in Palmer. There's the old home signal on the Central Vermont, the northward home signal for the Palmer Diamond, as I call it. And the significance of these 2 photographs is they were taken on my birthday in 1985. So I would have been turning 19, and that is will be Monday. I turn 55. So that all kind of puts that in perspective. I spent a lot of time photographing the people. After a while, I realized that the people were an important part of this. This would be in my top 10 all-time favorite photos. It's been published a few times. Unfortunately, editors have this annoying habit of cropping this foot, which is integral to the entire composition. When people do that, I get angry. Do not crop my pictures. Please don't do it. If you're out there listening and you've done it, you know, we'll accept apologies. Unfortunately, Facebook has like an auto crop feature. They just crop stuff left, right, and center, which doesn't make me real pleased with them. There was a box at the Palmer Diamond where Central Vermont trains. This replaced the tower about 1950. And so the CV crews would have a button to press. If the light was lit, that meant that there was no train within the circuit 2 blocks in either direction. If the light was dark, it either meant the light had burned out, which happened, or that there was a train in the circuit, in which case you could press the button all day long and nothing would happen. And in this particular case, he's yelling back to the engineer to say that the light's out. Well, the reason the light's out is because there was a Conrail train coming. Bob Buck introduced me to the Twin Ledges and the whole west end of the B&A, which I refer to as Washington Hill. This is the world's first true mountain grade. It's the first time that a railroad crossed a heavy mountain using adhesion principles. And so I've spent a lot of time photographing this. This is a meet between 2 trains, 23rd of March, 1986. It's TB6 eastbound. I forgot the symbol of the westbound. It's written in those notes. And not helpers, no, the light engines. I have very few photos of helpers on the B&A because they discontinued them shortly before I started taking regular pictures up here. They did bring them back in the 1990s with the UBO coal trains, but very limited use. Anyway, what's significant here is it's one of the few pictures I have of that particular signal lit. And there's a set of light engines. Conrail was pretty good about running light engines all over the place. So that's just railroad west of the Middlefield station. This has a lot of history. That's near what's now Back Bay Station. There's the old orange line going over the top, and there's a nice orange line connection. We've got the orange line out here, the new orange line, and that's the old orange line. That was about a month before they discontinued regular service on the old orange line. We've got some kind of bus. I'm not a bus person, but there's an old bus over there. That's Amtrak's Eastward Lakeshore Limited, train 448. And of course, now the portion on the left is the electrified line, and the new orange line is on the right. And so there's an awful lot of transition. Taking this picture even back then wasn't easy. I had to squeeze the Rolleiflex through this hole that had existed in this fence. And I'm standing probably where I shouldn't have been standing. But I know this annoys some people, but the rules, I just ignore rules. I know I give the rules exam at North Conway, and I have just always ignored the rules. And you do what you have to do. I knew a lot of guys on Conrail, and I would spend time talking to them and photographing. This is a conductor, Leo Lamanusi. He used to work for Conrail, and then later on he worked for Amtrak. I'm sure you know him, Bill. Really, really good guy. Big guy, really big guy of Romanian heritage. And there he is, lining a switch in the Palmer Yard about 1986. The bridges have always been a thing of mine. I love bridges. I've done a book on railroad bridges, so I've got a lot of nice pictures of Boston and Albany bridges at various times of the day and night, different times a year. I spent a lot of time with the maintenance crews, A, because they were all over the place, B, because they were friendly and they didn't mind having their picture taken. And I would hang out with them. And also they had a tendency to know when trains would be running and when they wouldn't be. These are guys putting in what's now CP83 in Palmer. And there's CP83 the day after Conrail cut it in. In 1986, Conrail took the traditional directional double track under Rule 251 system of transportation the way it had been for many, many years, and they converted it into what I call centralized traffic control. Conrail had its own name for that, but it's basically push button railroading with color light signals. And when they did that, it changed everything. It changed the way they did operations. And so this is a photo that kind of sums up Palmer at that moment in time. You have the old signal turned away. You can see the new signals in the distance. You have the old westward main pushed out of the way, the switch for CP83 cut in. And this is one of the first meets with the new arrangement. And that would have been in July of 1986. And again, we've got also that same day, a little further back, again, 2 trains meeting. And you can see the remains of the old diamond in the foreground. So I spent a lot of time photographing kind of before and after and during this transition from traditional directional double track to the new system. And again, these are all people that were kind of used to me. You'll notice I'm all sorts of places that today people might get edgy about. back then I was, you might take a couple pictures and I just kind of immerse myself into whatever was going on. Again, we have that Rolleiflex Model T with a Carl Zeiss lens. And this fellow here is welding the diamond at Palmer. These maintenance guys, I don't know them by name, but they were kind of used to me being everywhere. So another favorite Boston and Albany picture. It's the Conrail local with the old Boston and Albany freight house in Palmer. The freight house was demolished in January of 1989. I actually wrote a story about that for the local paper. But it was one of the last remaining freight houses on the Boston and Albany Conrail that actually still said Boston and Albany. After the railroad was single track, this is all the railroad after crossing the Quabog River in Palmer goes into the town of Munson just for a few miles. And I grew up in the town of Munson. So I was always trying to make interesting pictures of trains within Munson, including, Conrail trains. So here we have just over the river in Munson, Massachusetts, milepost 84. So 84 miles from Neyland Street, Boston. Top of State Line Tunnel, west end of the railroad, an eastbound train. It would have been in May of 1986, prior to them lifting, May of 1988, prior to them lifting the old westbound main. And a picture of about 2 days earlier of an eastbound train exiting the State Line Tunnel. And shortly before they lifted the tracks, or closed the track and then lifted the tracks on the old westbound main at State Line Tunnel. South Station, Boston. I'm told it looks different. I've been there in a while. Things change. I liked atmospheric pictures, ones that kind of conveyed the sense of the railroad without showing you a train. And this is in the summer of 1988, after they had taken one of the tracks out of service. You can see the old westbound main is rusted over, but it hasn't been lifted yet. You still have the code lines for the signals, which at that point were also out of service. So this is a photo showing the transition of the railroad. Again, Mass Central, John Kahn, who is the heart and soul of the Mass Central. He is the reason there is a Mass Central Railroad today on about 5 levels. I cover that in an article on the Mass Central I wrote for Trains, I think in 2010 it came out. But John Kahn was just an incredible guy, a railroader through and through, and just a really good guy. And there he is flagging a crossing near Ware. Is the train coming up the hill, and the train got about another mile and then stalled and had to bring another engine down. And the whole thing was a very interesting day for someone taking pictures. Didn't make the railroaders real happy. Sunset at Palmer, twice a year. The sun sets right down the main line. Now you can buy an app for about $8 on your phone that will tell you exactly when that happened. In 1989, when I made the photo, you just kept going, I think it'll be tomorrow, maybe next Tuesday, and eventually I got it right. So it took a little more work, but I got it. Kodachrome 25, taken with a Leica M2 with a 50mm Summicron lens, in case you were wondering. And in 1989, I moved out to California. I met some California photographers who are some of the finest photographers I've ever met. One of them was a SP dispatcher, now retired, Jamie Schmid. And I learned all sorts of stuff about photography that I hadn't learned in the previous 3 years studying photography at RIT, which is the Rochester Institute of Technology in Rochester, New York. So in 1991, I came back to the East for about 6 weeks to photograph trains in the autumn. And there's a picture of a Conrail train in the siding at Palmer with the Lakeshore 449 going past it. And the same freight a little bit later on, same location. Using light is key to photography. And as I became more interested in photography, my use of light became more sophisticated. That's just the kind of thing you learn. Some of the stuff was intuitive. And then as I progressed, I started using topographical maps. Now you can use all kinds of things like Google Earth to get the light exactly where I wanted. And that's Conrail's TV9 coming up through the rock cut. It's about 128.5 on the B&A, so 128 miles from here. The double track bridge over the Connecticut River in Springfield, Massachusetts. What's key to this picture? It's in the dead of winter and the river is still. The picture doesn't work if it doesn't do a reflection. Same morning, that's the Hartford local getting ready to shove back across that bridge into Springfield Station and then head down the New Haven towards Hartford. And so there's a pair of Conrail GE B23-7s leading the train that day, or in this case, shoving back on it. Sometimes bad things happen to good pictures. My dad got a Nikon scanner about 20 years ago, and I gave him like a half dozen of my finest photographs to scan, which it did. Unfortunately, as it scanned them, it also destroyed the emulsion. So this picture, the original does not exist in that condition anymore, owing to this fault with the scanner. And I threw the original away because I realized that every time I look at it, it would just make me unhappy. So it exists as a scan, and it exists as a dupe slide because I had the wherewithal, because it was one of my favorite pictures, to make a dupe slide of it. So there's some solace in that. And that's at Palmer, looking north on the central Vermont, the newer signals. These are the post 1986 signals, which have since been replaced again at Palmer. Again, Mass Central excursion train. Mass Central operated excursions until about 1998, and they were discontinued, and they're supposed to resume shortly if they haven't already. And that's along Route 181 in Palmer, trains headed northbound. I like weather. Weather and photography is one of these tricky things. Every so often you find an unusual weather event. This is at the field east of Palmer near CP 79. April of 1997. I had been in Japan, and Japan was I was in Tokyo, which was about 12 hours off, and I had this really weird thing happen where I was always sleeping when I should be awake and always awake when I should be sleeping. So I took a lot of pictures in the morning for about a month after getting back from Japan. One morning I went over, and the Quabog Valley, the Quabog River was making this like localized mist. And the mist was kind of hanging there even after the sun came up. So this is an eastbound, I think it was TV10B. It was just kind of looming out of the mist. I got this whole series of, train silhouetted against mist and the shadow. And it was kind of cool. It's one of the things you can't possibly predict, or maybe there's an app for that too. I don't know. Mist along the Quabog is one of those things that happen, but getting the mist just right. It's at West Warren, Massachusetts, which is a popular place these days for people to take pictures. Again, Mass Central. Mass Central did a lot of container work for Conrail up until the Conrail kind of got absorbed into CSX. And for a brief period, they had a pair of Alco Sentries, which seemed to go largely unphotographed. I photographed them intently. I have never seen anybody else's picture of them. So I don't know what the story is. And this westbound Conrail train with a pair of SD80 Max off in the distance there. The SD80 Max were really popular with the railway enthusiasts because they had this unusual paint scheme. I liked them because they had 20-cylinder diesels, and I've always really liked 20-cylinder EMD. They were a 20-cylinder 710, which had a very distinctive sound. Pair coming down with the ML 482 at Beckett, Massachusetts in January of 1998. This picture appeared on the cover of a book on Railroads of Palmer by Larry Lowenthal and Phil Opolowski. My mother actually was the graphic designer who designed the book, which had nothing to do with me, my picture on it. They picked the picture. And so that was the cover of the book. Photograph was taken also January of 1998. And Amtrak's 448 blitzing past the now defunct station at East Brookfield. The station burned, I believe, in September of 2009. Arson. There's the station shortly before it burned. Not all the stations have had bad fates. This is the steaming tender in Palmer the day the dining room opened to the general public. So that would have been 2005. An idea I had I kind of conceptualized when I was in college that took me a while to execute were keeping the camera in one place on a tripod and then exposing it as the light changed. Again, now you can buy an app that will tell you when the light changed. This is atop the rock cut at milepost 128. I didn't have an app. I just had spent a lot of time at this one location, and I knew at different times of the year where the light was. So I set the camera up. This is on Fuji Chrome. And all I did was take a sequence of pictures as the light was changing. And then finally we got, what was TV9, now was at the time Q119, the westbound Boston to Chicago intermodal train back when, CSX still served Boston. And this was right about the time I was beginning to transition from film to digital. Not that I've ever completely made the transition. I shot some film the other day. Now there's a digital photograph of an eastward CSX intermodal train at Twin Ledges that was exposed with a Canon 7D. And also with the Canon 7D, the CSX local running along the Mass Pike in Newton, which is one of the first places I learned to watch trains was at the old Star Market, which spans the Mass Pike. My mother would bring me to the supermarket, and she realized that if she put me in the window, I wouldn't go anywhere. So I'd sit there and E-units would come by with passenger trains and whatever else. And then when it's time to leave, she'd come and collect me. And all worked well. Cheap babysitter too. So I like clever little things. So here we have MBTA 10 at milepost 10. And the same locomotive at virtually the same locomotive, same location about 2 days later. You can fill in the dots. And a more recent picture of the Mass Central on digital format, again with the Canon 7D. That's Mass Central coming down Ware Hill. I can't pronounce the name of the little crossing, but there's a little crossing in there. And they have these two former Penn Central Jeep 38-2s that are done like in a Boston and Maine Bluebird style scheme. So moving further west. From 1989 to 1994, I lived in California, and I spent a lot of time up on Donner Pass. Spent a lot of time up on Donner Pass. I don't know how to put this gently, but I didn't do this lightly. So I moved out to California. First thing I did was call up Richard Steinheimer. Because Mark Hemphill, who then worked at CTC Board, said, yeah, if you want to do Donner Pass, talk to Steinheimer. Steinheimer, in case you don't know, was probably the best known Western living railroad photographer. I mean, just absolutely iconic. He was the guy. He'd spent a lot of time up. So I called him up, chatted with him for a while. He gave me some tips. Nice guy. And then I just basically applied my old technique of just simply walking the line. So I walked most of Donner over the course of 4 years. I did not walk through the big tunnel, but I walked most of the rest of it. And I did get a letter from Southern Pacific at some point to allow me to take pictures in day or night. It was issued by the Vice President of Transportation, and it was kind of self-renewing. They sent me a new one. I don't know, for about 4 or 5 years they sent me one, and then they got merged into UP, so it stopped mattering. So here we have an eastward train crossing Donner Pass at the snow sheds at Norden. At that time, there were very few wooden snow sheds left. And this one was obviously not long for the world. And the photo was made in December of. As a related caveat, I've never owned a television. My parents had a television when I was a kid. It was like a black and white thing. And I've lived in places where they have a television, but I've never actually owned one. And in most of the apartments I've had, I haven't had. Are we back live again? Oh, okay. So we just had a deviation of some discussion of television, but this photo was made in December of 1990. And you'll notice the amount of snow on the ground here at Norden, right? So Donner Pass is kind of famous for its snow, but I moved out to California, there was a bit of a drought. Here we are inside the same sheds there at Norden, and we're gonna just scream through these. So Donner Pass, real heavy trains, real steep grade. It's the mother of all Western mountain grades, completed 1869, part of the original Transcontinental Railroad. Mid-train helpers. It's good. Okay, so Steinheimer had written this book called, I think, The Hill or something to that effect. It had come out about the time that I arrived there. This is a direct ripoff of the cover of his book. So one day I was up here taking this picture. Now, see, the reason I'd come here because there were only a handful of locomotives that still had the old Mars lights. That's the unoscillated. So this one had one of those. And I was trying to replicate the Steinheimer picture. And I bump into Dick right here. And I go, I'm sorry, Dick, I'm stealing your picture. He goes, oh, that's okay. I stole it from somebody else. So I spent a lot of time up here. I mean, I've got, if I made 100 trips over Donner in 5 years, I'm probably being conservative. I would go up here every weekend, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth over the mountain, taking a lot of pictures. This is in Coldstream Canyon where the track's at 2 levels. So it comes up, it goes through this huge horseshoe curve called Stanford Curve after Leland Stanford, who was one of the big 4, governor of California, et cetera, et cetera. It's a lot of history. Anyway, that's the back of the train. That's the helpers. So really into the helpers. Okay, so again, helpers again in the wintertime. Now there's a little bit of snow on the ground. One of the things about Donner, it's kind of famous for the snow. At one point, my mother asked, she goes, well, how many inches of snow? And I go, inches? We get like, they measure feet. They don't bother with inches. That's ridiculous. Yuba Pass in the winter, did a little bit of hiking in there. I didn't have any kind of fancy equipment. I owned a Toyota Corolla for most of this. I had moon boots that I'd bought at, there wasn't a Walmart, but whatever the equivalent back in that it was like, they were like $15 boots. I just kind of go up and do it. It was just sheer adrenaline. Didn't do much sleeping back then either. So Troy, which is on the west, it's kind of on the west slope going, that's an eastbound. And again, Southern Pacific went through various phases, but here the helpers were at the back of the train. Sometimes they were in the middle, sometimes the back. It had to do with the weight and the makeup of the train, which occasionally the rules would change because the SP would have a disaster. I like doing shots that are extremely difficult to do. Now, I can't take all the credit for this. My dispatcher friend who I told you about, he's the actual one that got me to do this. I bumped into him at Donner Summit. He goes, oh, I've got a picture. We got to go do this. He goes, you can only do this in June. And he knew there'd be an eastbound train that had to run track 1. Track 1 was hardly used at this point in time. It's gone now. The only way to get to this was to walk through the snow sheds. And if you look all the way back on the right, you can see snow sheds. So we had to walk about a mile through snow sheds. And as we're walking through the snow sheds, all of a sudden you can start to hear the EMD roar. And so we started walking a bit quicker. Then we had to get out of the snow shed and come up the hill. So, and I get all the way up here. And if you notice really carefully, if you look carefully, you'll see there's a black line at the right of the photo. That's because this was frame 38. Anyway, so sometimes you get it, but not by much. And so there's a SNTAC coal train, Skyline Torona. It was a Skyline mine in Colorado to Torona in California, and it was a regular feature on Donner. And it's bathed in its own brake shoe smoke, which I always thought was kind of cool. Briefly, there was a unusual train called the Transisco Tour Train. It ran San Jose to Reno and back. It only lasted from December of 1990 to April of 1991. I remember the day it was discontinued because I called my friend at the dispatching office and I go, where's the red train? That's what I called it. He goes, oh, that's gone. I'm like, what do you mean it's gone? Because it's canceled. I go, today? He goes, no, it's done. So anyway, I got a few pictures of it before it was canceled. It was pretty cool. And it ran with FP45s, or maybe they were F45s. I think they were F45s. And it had all these like XUP domes and whatnot. It was a neat train. Okay, so track 1 from Shed 47 to Norden was the original 1869 alignment, right? It's the one that the Chinese built and they had to blast through and drag stuff over with sleds, all very famous, right? Well, this was at the very end of its life. And in 1993, SP abandoned it. They got this guy named Moyers off the Illinois Central, and he liked ripping up track, and so they ripped this up. Last time I was up here was about 2009, and the kids, if you want to call them that, the artists, had covered all the sheds with graffiti. You can now drive the old right-of-way, but there's no chance of you ever seeing a train up here. At this point in time, getting a train on track 1 was not an easy thing to do. And I'd come up here every Sunday afternoon and sit there and wait, because you'd never know until they called the signal at Shed 47 which way they were going. If they called green over red, you were in business. If it was yellow over yellow, they were crossing over and going through the big tunnel. Stanford Curve, and that's a SP stack train going into the curve right at the end of the day. I always used to use the light as kind of a sculpting method. So backlit trees would really illuminate them well. Donner Pass backlit looks much better than Donner Pass frontlit in many situations. Frontlit coming down at Yuba Pass. Sunset at, this is a location I'd call East to Alta. It's known in some timetables as Old Gorge. It's a difficult location to get to if you don't know where it is, but you can virtually drive here. Snow, I'd mentioned snow. They get a bit of snow up on Donner. When it starts snowing, they bring out flangers, and if it starts snowing a little more, they bring out these big Jordans. These are big Jordan spreaders that were specifically designed for snow service on Southern Pacific. And it's amazing how much snow they get. So here we have one of those coal trains coming up track 1 in the dead of winter. And it's working hard to the point where the snow sheds are just breathing forth effluents. I'm sure somebody at the EPA or somewhere in California would have absolute fits over this kind of thing, but it makes for great pictures. And again, I like going places that are hard to get to. So here are the snow sheds that I'd walked through in that earlier picture on the backside of Mount Judah in the dead of winter. Westbound train coming up the east slope of Donner near Boca Dam. Jordan spreaders working near Soda Springs in the dead of winter. And again, I did all this the hard way, like on foot, hiking in, just making it happen. Again, I had some inside intel, as they would say, but I mean, I knew what was going on, but there weren't any cell phones back then either. So here we have the rotaries. I've only seen the rotaries run 3 days, February 22nd, 23rd, and 24th, 1993. And In the middle of all that, I had a court date in Reno because I'd had an altercation with a garbage truck on a one-lane road in Nevada. And the way it was explained to me by the officer that attended the scene afterwards, he goes, even though you didn't cause the problem, I can't cite the county driver, so therefore it's your fault. So I had to go to court to plead my case. And they said, look, basically the way it works is this is Nevada. It's $75 for like the court processing fee. It won't go on your record. There's no ticket issued. And it all just goes away. And that says more about Nevada than any other thing that I know. The one thing, and Chris, just plug your ears. So I am standing on a 20-foot drift. In the adrenaline rush to get here, I waded through a lot of snow to get the plow coming out of tunnel 41 with all the trees. So after the plow goes by, and it came back, and here it is. There's those same snow sheds you saw earlier, right? After all this is done, I now have to get back to my truck. At that stage, I had a pickup truck. It's two-wheel drive. And I realized I'm standing on this berm of snow that's like way higher than from here to there, right? And no one on the planet knows where I am. That was not a happy feeling, but I did get back, as far as I know. Maybe this is all some sort of weird dream that I'm having as the snow's melting around me. Shed 47, after Moore's administration, lifted one of the two tracks. The one they lifted is obviously the one around Round Mountain, and that's Donner Lake off in the distance. The famous Donner Party, who had a bad thing happen to them, they were along that lake way back, like pre-railroad. This is another favorite Donner Pass picture. So I'm looking down Coldstream Canyon. There's a westbound train on the lower level. The glint lights hit the train, illuminated the exhaust, and eventually the train will wind up, go around the curve at Stanford Curve, and then come up and be over here. And there's a black and white version of this too, because I had parallel Nikon F3s. I had one loaded with color film and one loaded with black and white. This is a one of a kind. I like one of a kinds. This happened once, it will never happen again. So we have brand new, right out of the box, GE-9s. These are the first wide cab diesels that Southern Pacific had. This is like June of 1994. The day after this picture was taken, the track that train is on is going to be taken out of service. So that's the old number one track. The number two track at that stage was out of service. They're going to cut the track over. This was their first run of these types of locomotives to California over Donner. This happened once. It will never happen again. I was the only one that got the picture. Fast forward, now it's 2003. I'd been living in Ireland. I'd done all this stuff, and I'm back. It's now UP over on Donner, and I'm at my favorite location there at East Alta, 2,000 feet above the Sacramento River. It's Halloween day, and it's snowing. And this is what I just acquired another Rolleiflex Model T loaded with Tri-X, and we'll get into a little bit about the processing. The black and white processing of this is very unusual. I don't do anything easy. There's always something complicated, but at one point in time, I had been talking to David Plowden, who's kind of known for his black and white, and he also studied at RIT, and I'm looking at some of the prints on his wall, and I go, how do you get that kind of highlight detail? And he told me, and gave me a recipe of how to do it. And so I started applying this technique. There's actually a much longer version of the story. Anyway, fast forward a little bit more. John Gruber and I were up on Donner. This is about 2003, about that same time. And here's the westbound Amtrak's California Zephyr. I apologize, there's not more Amtrak pictures in here. I've got lots of them, but there's a few. Anyway, so here's the westbound California Zephyr coming up at Boca Dam. And again, I'm fascinated by all the signaling. And the SP and the Santa Fe use this kind of cantilevered signal bridge, which is really, really very Western. Anyway, so we're here doing that. And if you look carefully, you'll find that there's somebody in the fireman's seat taking my picture. Some buddy of mine worked for BNSF, and they were doing like stuff in a professional capacity, and they knew that I knew a little bit about Donner, and they said, hey, we got a company truck. Would you show us like the good locations on Donner to take pictures? It's like 2005. I'm like, yeah, that's not a problem. So I met them, and I know how to get to all these places, but I used to get there the hard way, like just on foot. So we basically drove. We still had to climb up. So we're up above, this is at Eagle Lakes Road, that's Shed 10. At this point in time, the UP had done something dodgy to one of the tracks, or the SP had done something dodgy on the track. There's only one functional track. So we went up here. That's the last of the Donner Pass pictures. I actually have a few more Donner Pass pictures in the UP era, but that's for another program. So moving right along. Ireland. I'm going to give you like the 20-second version. I was interested in Ireland. Some relatives of mine had been born there like a long time ago, long time ago. And so I went there in 1998 for like a week, and half my stuff is still there. So I spent a lot of time photographing Irish railways. I started in 1998. I went over with an an old Nikon F2 that my friend Brian Jennison had lent me, and my F3T, which I brought along, and like 3 lenses. I had like a 50, a 24, and I think like a 105. And for 7 months, that's all I used. Ireland was like going back in time. They still had steam heated passenger trains. They had, never mind air brake. They had vacuum brake freight trains. They had towers and semaphores all over the place. Lots of members of staff. I mean, there's just people everywhere, and they were all really friendly. So you could do anything you wanted. It was fantastic. So these were like my first drive around. The first couple of weeks, I'd like rented a car. They say hire a car there, and I just kind of drove around. I just couldn't believe there's semaphore signals everywhere, and all of them mechanical. This was just too good to be true. Almost all the trains were powered by locomotives, and all the locomotives were all GM. So I'm like, well, this is all just good news all around. And again, you could kind of do whatever you wanted. That's at Limerick. These are all like in the first year or so. There's this cool train shed at Pierce Station, formerly Westland Row, world's oldest big city terminal in continuous use, opened 1834, always been open. Now the shed's new. It was built sometime, I don't know, 1870, 1880, somewhere in that, but the station has been continuous use 1834 till now. That's kind of cool. Ireland was the first nation outside of England to embrace the railroad. The thing that's a bit strange is it's not standard gauge. Well, they say it's standard gauge. It's British imperial gauge, 5'3". The RPSI, Railway Preservation Society Ireland, runs steam trains and now some diesel trains too. So I kind of got loosely involved with them, loosely in that I'm not actually a member, but I would participate in visual sorts of ways. I'd make forays up to Northern Ireland where they had examples of the somersault signal, which is kind of hard to explain, but basically this kind of thing, when it clears, it kind of flips over, which is why they call it somersault signal. It was a really antique type of signal. There were still quite a few of those. That's on the branch up to Port Rush, and they had these antique 80 class rail cars, which it's kind of hard to explain. They're like a diesel rail car, but they made a really weird sound. They're known as thumpers. Ireland at that stage still had a lot of freight. It doesn't now. It has some, but not very much. There was freight everywhere. And you kind of had to know when it was running. So you'd get tips. That's down at Thurles, which is about halfway from Dublin to Cork, milepost 86. Bribery goes a long way. And I learned a long time ago, give back. So what I would do is I would take black and white prints, and I would have envelopes for people. So this is the cabin at Ballinasloe on the Galway line. And in 1998, I had photographed the man working the cabin. And so I come back, and he's retired, but this guy knew him. And so I gave this guy some pictures. And at some point in time, the cabinet closed. And I was talking to the guy in the station. He goes, oh, yeah, your pictures are all on the wall in here. So it always helps to give back. Now it's a lot easier. You can just email people pictures. But back then, I would always give prints. This was my business card for a number of years. It's the Navan branch. It was actually beyond the Navan branch. It was a Kingcorp branch, and there was a gypsum mine up there, and a couple days a week they would haul a gypsum train down. This is all heavily overgrown, and they'll probably never see a train again. But I did manage to get up there and get a couple of shots of the Kingcorp branch when it was still being operated. That was in would have been 2001, I believe. Johnny O'Mara, who was one of the senior members of the Irish Railway Record Society, he passed away in his kind of mid-90s a while ago, but he was an active member of the Railway Preservation Society as well. So he's reading the newspaper in the cabin at Mullingar. And I've always liked this picture because it's this kind of split view, right? So I'm actually hanging out the window of the cabin, open the window. So here's the steam engine that Johnny come in on, and he's just reading the paper, and you have the man working the plant there. And this was a old school double junction on the old Midland route. So cool pictures like that. This picture sums up the transition in Ireland in one go, and there's a joke in here in that the transition is you have these 1961 built GM diesels. There was the first GM diesels built at LaGrange, exported to Western Europe. All of that has to be used, or the whole thing doesn't work. Ireland bought 15 of them. I got a bunch of pictures of them. So they were the old guard, and you have this brand new Japanese rail car with the destination board Belfast, and there's your joke, because the 2800s have never been to Belfast. And then there's a bunch of 121 class diesels working down at the North Yard in Dublin, including with an empty gypsum train. It was very, very unusual in my era to see a single one working. And there's a long story. I wrote like a 15-page article in one of the Irish journals explaining all that. So you'll have to go back and read that. This is the DART, which is a Dublin Area Rapid Transit. And it's basically just, they electrified some existing main lines, including the original 1834 main line, for a suburban service. And they finally got things coordinated. I think they're either on a 10 or a 15-minute headway. There's an awful lot to be said for, regular interval timetabling. It works. The people understand it. You carry more people, you make better use of your trains, and the trains are at the same place, all through the hours. It just works. Anyway, so there's the DART. Pan shot with a Contax G2. Actually, it's not really a pan, it's a pacing shot. I'm on a railway excursion. I leaned out the window and this train was running parallel to us, which is why these two guys are looking. They're not really interested in me. It's like, what's this? And there I lean out and snap their pictures. There you are. That was taken in 2003. Ross Cray Cabin, which is still there. That's on the Nina branch, which is one of the most lightly used lines in all of Ireland. And it still has mechanical signaling even as we speak. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of trains. One of the other cabins on the line is Bird Hill, and this was I used to call him Friendly Jimmy. He was the signal operator at Bird Hill Cabin. Really friendly guy. Couldn't understand a word he said. He had this real thick, rural Limerick accent, and oh my God, it was just. And if you look carefully, you'll see that I'm holding up the Rolleiflex, looking through the field finder. One of the things about the Rolleiflex is you have to shoot from the hip, and it reverses the picture. So it means you'd always have to compose everything backwards. But if you use the field finder, you just punch this window out, I'd be looking right at the subject. There's no interpretation. It's just raw. And there's something that just works about that. Another signal cabin. I was only in this one once, despite the fact that my apartment, the one that I'd been living in for 15 years after the picture was taken, was like a 5-minute walk from here. This is Houston Cabin, which closed in 2002. I didn't move into the apartment until 2004. And that's Terry Donovan. He was the regular signalman at the Houston Cabin. But I spent, the chief signal engineer brought me in here, and they're just getting ready to close it. So I went in here and took a bunch of pictures. Photograph was made with a Zeiss Hologon 16mm lens, which was an extremely expensive piece of glass. I bought it for $1,100 in 2002 to take pictures like this. My friend Tim Doherty, I stopped using the contacts over. He goes, "Do you still have that?" I'm like, "Yeah." He goes, "You might want to sell it." I sold it for like $1,800, like 10 years later. So I don't know if I should have sold it or not. I just don't have a camera to use it for it. But anyway, so Kalookan Cabin. I could give you a whole program on Kalookan Cabin. We used to come down here every Saturday evening. I mean, I spent a lot of time. It's on the old Midland. That's the Sligo going down with GM and Mark IIs. Regular signal in there was a camera enthusiast. He was a car enthusiast. So we'd sit down. He had this television. So we'd watch movies on the television and, work the cabin. So that's his hands. And he understood exactly what I was trying to do. So I actually have recordings of this too. I've got digital audio tape recordings of this cabin. This is a really cool place. It closed in 2005. Another potential program is the weed spraying train. I would embed myself with the weed spray crew. So there's the whole weed spray crew. On the far right, you've got Eamon Jones. He was the driver. You've got the inspector, Pat O'Neill, the signalman for Castlereagh Cabin where we were. The big guy behind the guy kneeling was the fitter. He's like the mechanic. Then you got the guard, Dominic, and then you got John from Abbey Leaks on the left, right? And then the guy leaning down is Sean Brown, who owns the pub at Castlereagh. And now what had happened is, I can't tell you the whole story. You're gonna have to connect the dots. It might involve something like that. And we stop here and I'm like, "Hey, have you been to the Hell's Kitchen pub?" And I go, "What's that?" "Oh, it's really cool. It's like they've got a locomotive in the pub and all this like rare memorabilia." No, none of these guys are railway enthusiasts, of course. And they go, no, what's that? How do we get down there? And I go, "I'll just call Sean Brown." So I said, "Hey, Sean, the weed spray's in the loop here for 2 hours. The guys on the crew want to come down and see your pub." So he came down, brought us all down in 2 batches in his little car, cooked everybody bacon and cabbage. And I'm not going to say that we consumed anything except water. And then we all came back and took the train up to Westport. Just one of them things. And the weed spray train, officially, its job was actually to spray weeds. It did do a bit of that. And there's Dom and Eamon. Dom was actually the guard. He's sitting in the guard seat, and Eamon's on the platform there. These were just really good people. This was the best railfin excursion I've ever been on. It would go on for months. And you'd be the only one there, except, me and my handful of friends. Except you didn't have to pay anything, and it didn't have an itinerary. The next best thing was the sugar beet. From the end of October, right about now, till early January, they would take sugar beet, load it into antique 4-wheel wagons at Wellington Bridge, County Wexford, and they would drag them over to Mallow in County Cork. And they'd run, 6-7 trains a day. And it was a really intense thing. You'd start seeing color after a while. So there's sugar beet trains would run really, really intensely for 3 months, and then it would go quiet. And I'd be down there. I probably spent 50 60, 70 days, as they say, on the beat. And a lot of times the weather would be miserable. And sometimes the sun would come out. Photo was taken with my Nikon F3 with a 180 millimeter lens. It's a Carrick-on-Suir, County Tipperary. Top of the bank at Nicholastown, one of those 121 type diesels. There's another diesel behind it. These were the heaviest trains in Ireland. The four-wheel trains were about 750 UK tons, so that's 240,000 pounds per ton. Sorry, 2,240,000, 200, I'm not really bad with math, 2,240 pounds per ton. Got that? So the tons are a little bigger, but the trains are really small. Again, photos go a long way. There's Pius. He was the regular signalman at Carrick-on-Suir. So, to keep him. Now, Pius would never admit to be a railway enthusiast. One day he slipped up. And he goes, "Oh, yeah, me and the missus were over in Portugal. And there's like this little narrow gauge railroad that we traveled on." And I'm like, aha! I knew it. So the sugar beet, again, I have thousands of pictures of just the sugar beet and the people involved with it. It was just a good thing all around. So one of the things that hardly anybody photographed was the processing plant in Mallow, where they emptied the sugar beet out and they would process them because you had to get into the plant. So we just showed up one night and asked, there was a guard shack there, and we're just taking some pictures. Is it all right if we come in? Oh, sure. And just let it water around, So I got pictures of them hosing. This is how they got the beet out of the wagons, is that they would use these high pressure hoses because the beet would be all clustered with mud and whatever else was in it. And so they would hose the beets out of the wagons. Oh my God, was it cold. It doesn't ever freeze in Ireland. Well, it does, but very rarely. I mean, it's probably like 45 degrees, but when it's 45 degrees in December and you get this thick fog everywhere, it just cuts right through you. I don't think I've ever been so cold. Okay, so black and white. All right, so I do a lot of black and white. I have this recipe where you under-process the film. In other words, you don't process it enough, right? I use a very, very dilute developer, usually a two-stage development. So I'm using two different kinds of developers. One for the shadows, one for the highlights. And I've got that all figured out to get the highlights and the shadows. The highlights, the bright area, shadows, the dark area. To get those parts just where I need them on this, what they call a D-log H curve, right? And then after you've done all that, then you tone the negatives in selenium. And what I use is this formula that David Plowden gave me. I use a 1:9 form, and he said about 9 minutes. I usually go about 7.5. And what that does is, if you look at the headlight on that sugar beet train at the top, let's see if we can get that to come up. Oh, there we go, bigger. That is the brightest highlight in the whole thing. But it does a couple of things. One, these negatives, assuming something bad doesn't happen, they'll last almost forever. I mean, these negatives are archival beyond archival because the selenium is a very neutral substance. The selenium, it does an ion exchange with the silver halides in the film. And so it doesn't increase the grain, but it increases your dynamic range. It also sharpens the picture. It gives it a little better acutance. So it gives you a sharper picture with better dynamic range. And it gives you that kind of silvery look. Now, if you go too much, it gets a bit intense. But anyway, that's something, I don't do it with all the film, but on a miserable, bleak Irish day, it's the best way to take pictures. Or it worked for me anyway. So that's at Cherryville Junction. There's a sugar beet train. Long story behind that. We don't have time for that right now. Monasterevin on the Cork main, and that's 076. 076 is unusual because it had a problem with its diesel engine. So they had to buy another diesel engine, a 645 diesel that came from Sweden, and it has a different turbocharger, so it sounds different, and you can hear 070. If your ears are tuned into locomotives, you can hear this one coming from miles away. Like so. The most modern locomotives are the 201 class diesels, which were built contemporary with the SD80 Max we had pictures of earlier. It's an EMD. It's got a 710, 12-cylinder 710, turbocharged, dual cab. It's basically an F59, but on 6 motor trucks with 2 cabs and this kind of weird boxy thing. That's on a cement train at Gieshel on that's the Port Arlington to Athlone branch, I guess you want to call it. I like the glint light. Getting glint light in a place where it's cloudy all the time is kind of a problem. This is the Friday only Ballina meeting, the regular Westport at, can't remember the name of the cabin, but there was a cabin that was only operated, it was only open 1 day a week just to make this meet. He'll come to me here in a bit. My apartment for 15 years, from 2004 until like last year, was here at Island Bridge in Dublin. And that is this. That's the Guinness. So Guinness would be loaded at Houston and be brought over to the North Wall, and then they'd separate it out and put it on the liners to get it down the country. And that ended in 2006. So that's the view from my balcony at Island Bridge in Dublin. Liam Dunn, who was the gatekeeper at Fdown and other places too, he was a really good man. And we'd often just come down here and hang out with him for hours. And if a train came by, that was great. And if not, that was okay too. So here we are at Fdown this is the Waterford to Limerick Junction line. Big changes started happening in the early 2000s. The railroad went rail car, like heavily rail car. There's today very few locomotives in service. Most of the passenger trains are one flavor or another of diesel rail car. And that's one of the Japanese rail cars coming out of these are Spanish built. These are CAFs. And you can actually see these were the originally 2900s, later the 29000s. So there's lots and lots and lots of diesel rail cars, which is a good thing and a bad thing. It makes the trains a bit uniform. And so most of the passenger trains in Ireland now look like that. Those are built in Korea. Those are Hyundai Rotems, and they've got lots and lots and lots and lots of these, and they all look just like that. The only difference is some are 3-piece, some are 4-piece, some are 5-piece. They had 6-piece for a while, but they didn't like that. So, if you get pictures of 6-piece, that's really radical. They do run a bit of freight. They still have 071 class diesels, and that's a 201 class diesel, and that's at Island Bridge Junction. My apartment is just off camera, just over the tops of those buildings to the left. The obelisk is the Wellington Testimonial. It's the largest obelisk in Europe. It sits in the Phoenix Park, just roughly over the top of the Phoenix Park tunnel, but not quite. And again, I still do black and white. So here's a black and white of a Cork train heading down road at Island Bridge Junction about 2015. Don't have a lot of Northern Ireland here. Northern Ireland is almost exclusively rail car, except for the steam engine. So that's at Whitehead where they keep the steam engine. And we'll cover that here a little bit. And grade crossings are a thing. They don't really have grade crossing accidents in Ireland. And there's a reason for that. All the grade crossings are 4-quadrant gates. All the gates are observed. It doesn't necessarily mean there's someone on the ground. There's a lot of them are done from control centers. So before the train comes, these gates come down, and before they clear the signal for the train to cross the crossing, somebody has to say, "Yeah, there's nothing stuck on the crossing," and they press a button. Labor intensive, but grade crossing accidents are extremely rare. Another somersault signal. That one was at Castle Rock about 3 weeks before it was taken out of service forever. Well, it was removed from this location. I believe the RPSI preserved them. And same day from the Bluffs at Downhill in County Derry. Cross-border service between Dublin and Belfast is the Enterprise, jointly operated with NIR, Northern Irish Railways, and Irish Rail. And that's at the viaduct at Drogheda, which is actually in the Republic. And also at the viaduct at Drogheda, same day, just about 2 years ago. That's the River Boyne, famous Battle of the Boyne and all that, right? So, and that's engine number 85, which is a former Great Northern compound. It's a 440 compound built in the mid-1930s. So it's a 3-cylinder locomotive. And I copied this from another very well-known photographer named Charlie Friel, but he had done a very similar picture. But as the train is accelerating out of the station from Drogheda, the locomotive has what they call an interceptor valve, that when it reaches a certain pressure and or speed, that part I'm not entirely clear about, it switches from simple operation to compound operation. And when that happens, the exhaust does this kind of little hook. So again, that's all Charlie Friel. I just copied his photo. And same engine, same day, different bridge. That's at Laytown. This locomotive was built to haul express passenger trains really fast between Dublin and Belfast. I've seen it work at 90. I think officially it can go 50. It's a very fast little engine. Driver Ken Fox on the compound approaching Limerick Junction about 3 years ago. And working the Cork main down towards Mallow. And again, a very fast engine. These photos were made with a Zeiss 12 millimeter lens that I use on. I've got a Fuji XT1 that I have this. It's not a hologon, but it's something like that. A Toted. It's a Zeiss Toted. And just to show the contrast between old and new. So here's one of the modern Hyundai rail cars coming up road, and Irish Rail's 85 in the loop down road at Thurles, and that was taken 3 years ago. Again, I still do black and white. So here we have the steam crew on 85 at Connolly Station. And you can't have Ireland without a little rain. So there's the dart in the rain at night. And that's thanks to my Fuji X-T1, which you can do amazing things with at all times of the day and night. And that photo was taken just under 2 years ago. So I haven't been to Ireland since then because now I'm involved with Conway Scenic. As some of you might know, I'm the manager of marketing and events at Conway Scenic, and I have to make a promo for the company. It's the greatest tourist railroad ever. Anyway, as far as I'm concerned. So here we are on locomotive 252. It's a former Main Central Jeep 38. As I say, it's our newest piece of equipment. It was delivered a month after I was. And we're crossing Frankenstein Trestle in May at the end of the day with it's a theater, a murder mystery theater special. There's Dick Osterhout. He's our regular MOD, manager of the day, station master, train master, or station master, yard master, dispatcher. Train master is a different job. Sorry, got them confused. Anyway, so there he is with 7470 shortly after it came out of the shop after its restoration 2 years ago. And a picture that I've used a lot. This appears on billboards. It appears in advertising. What I remember about this is I hiked into milepost 64 and I got bit by a tick, which did not make me very happy, but it did make a good picture. Now, when I come in, I usually come in by rail because I'm not going to walk back there and get chomped on again. The combination of May weather and being by the rivers, not good for ticks. Anyway, so there we are. So some of these are posed. This was a train. I got them to give me the train one day, and we got actors and regular people. And that's actually Bob Bentley of the Mass Central on the right. She's filling in as a passenger. And we did all kinds of video and film for promotional stuff, advertising and whatnot. There's Dwight Smith and his lady friend. Shortly before they dedicated the locomotive to him, that was taken about 2.5 years ago at our roundhouse in Turntable at North Conway. Dwight Smith, of course, being the founder of Conway Scenic, good guy all around, well-known rail fan, a member of this organization. I think pretty much everyone knows who he is. He's in his mid-90s now. He's a good guy. This was, we had brought at that time it was known as the Notch train. Now I call it the Mountaineer. But anyway, the train up to Crawford. We brought the train up overnight to Crawford, tied the train down so that I could take pictures of the train coming down grade for promotional purposes. One of the problems with Conway Scenic, even though it's the greatest tourist railroad ever, is we run the whole thing backwards. In other words, we run it to suit the people who ride the train instead of the people who want to photograph the train, which is fine, except if you need pictures for publicity purposes, in which case you have to do some different things. So I got them to bring the train up here and then run it down. And I had a playlist. Remember, I take notes. Well, I had taken 4 or 5 high rail trips at different times a day. So I could figure, okay, we want to be here at 8:45, we want to be here at 9:15, and worked all the way down the mountain. You've probably seen some of the pictures. If not, I failed in my duty because we've published them here, there, and everywhere. They're in billboards, they're in magazines, they're in here and there. Anyway, so I'll show you those pictures some other day. That's a 30-second exposure by the light of the full moon. And we got somebody from the AMC to come down and turn the lights on and off. So I had them on the phone. Okay, lights off, lights on, lights off. So they wouldn't burn out the rest of the picture. Anyway, there you are. Locomotive 573 is a Jeep 7 former Main Central. It was E. Spencer Miller's engine when they used to run a business train. That's in the little cemetery on the Conway branch. It's just kind of a cool thing. Steam in the Snow, most of you probably know about that. This was Steam in the Snow 2020, so just under 2 years ago. It's where I met Chris. This is shortly after I met Chris. I didn't know that we'd be engaged and all that kind of thing. But anyway, here we are. I just figured I'd throw a couple pictures in because this is like the event that kind of brought all this together, right? In a lot of ways. Connor Maher, who was one of the twins, he worked for us then, now works for Pan Am with the Dwight Smith on Day of Steam in the Snow. And I stood next to Chris and Matt at this location at Notchland right about this time. So there we are in the snow. I was actually using my Fuji X-T1 to do both stills and video that day because I didn't want to physically tow around all the heavy video here in the snow. And there we are down at Cobb Farm Road. The rest of you are all there behind the exhaust. So anyway, it was cold and wet, as you may remember. Anyway, so one of the things that I do is I do stuff differently to make people encourage people to ride the train. So we started running Snow Train right after Steam in the Snow, which has been extremely successful. Ever since people wouldn't ride the train in the winter. I don't know why they said that. I don't really care why they said that. Turns out they were wrong. Anyway, so people like to ride the train in the winter, and there's the Snow Train. We usually do an interval service. Got that from Europe. We do an interval service, and we run it, weekends in January and February in the last 2 full weeks of the month because there's vacations happening and people come up in huge numbers. There's a lot of ads. I put them all kinds of places. We have them in Yankee Magazine. We have them in USA Today. We have them in all the local papers. They're here, there, and everywhere. My job is to make sure that people know the railroad exists and that we are running trains. The main photograph there is a picture I took at Frankenstein Bridge from the west end of the bridge. Last year, about this time, was actually, I think, the 27th of September. We had early foliage. So there's a JPEG of the original without the ad. So there you are. And the same train, I think the same day coming back. Again, more or less the same location. I actually like the other side of the bridge in some ways better than the bridge side of the bridge. So the bridge is behind me. Same location, just one way versus the other. I like finding locations on Conway Scenic that I haven't seen done before. Now, I'm not to say that no one has ever taken a picture here before, but I haven't seen it. So that's down at milepost 83, which is kind of difficult to get to. What I would do is I would have our track car driver at least get me one direction, because it's about a 2-mile walk from any place to get in here. So, and that's the eastward mountaineer coming down the mountain in the fall. Adam Bartley is one of our younger engineers, and that was one of his first runs up to Crawford last spring. And sometimes, despite me spending all kinds of time looking for locations up on the mountain, in this case, I had been riding on the mountain here. It had been miserable up at the top. This was about maybe 3-4 weeks ago. This was a tracking the light thing. You can look back and find out exactly when it was taken. Sometimes, even though it's miserable up on the mountain, you get down to North Conway and the sun comes out and you get these dramatic clouds, and the best light of the whole day is right where you started. Last year for the 470 club trip, they put the 4266 and which is their F7A and our 573, and they ran the trip up the mountain, and it snowed. I know we're running short on time, but I'll tell you the story. People are, I can't get my head around people at all sometimes. So this train has mostly non-470 club people that are just riding it. So I organize these photo stops. So we let people out at the old Evans house, you know, the Mount Willard section house, and it had snowed. It's like October 17th, I think. And there's like, you know, this much snow on the ground, and it's still, you know, kind of coming down. So we let all these people off, and this woman comes up to me as I'm, you know, directing people around, and she points down and she goes, "When did you put this here?" And I go, "I haven't." I go, "You know, God put it here, nature. I mean, it's like snowing now." She goes, "It's too soon." And I'm thinking, this isn't Disney World, you know, it's like, I don't have any control. I think it's kind of cool myself, but okay, whatever. Next, moving to the next picture. So here we are up at Crawford, and there's a bit of snow. And just to get the F unit up there is kind of cool, but to get the snow and the foliage all in one picture is kind of, you know, it's kind of unusual. And there's Corey. He actually is a regular engineer for the New Hampshire North Coast. He usually works the gravel train, but he works for us, and he's a member of the 470 Club. He's one of the more important members of the 470 Club, and he also does a lot of the maintenance on the engine. So here he is with the 4266 at Crawford last year. And by the way, I'll be up there again on Saturday because they're doing their annual trip Saturday, so I need to assist with that. And sometimes the 4266 is the only thing we have available. And last fall, the train master comes to me and goes, "I need you as a conductor." I go, "I'm not qualified." He goes, "I don't care." He goes, we gotta go down to Conway to pick up an excavator. And I'm like, "Okay." I go, "What are we gonna use?" He goes, "Well, all we have is the 66. So we put the 66 on the work train with the caboose, and I rode up the caboose and called him back from North Conway all the way to Conway. And when we got there, I took a few pictures, but this is not a rail plant excursion. People go, "Why didn't you tell us about this?" I go, "I only knew it about 5 minutes before I got on the train." And this whole thing was just kind of thrown together at the last minute because our boss said, "Go get the excavator." So, you know, there's not a lot of warning on somebody. A lot of these work trains, if I did tell you it was going to run, it won't. So a couple of weeks ago, the 470 Club, no, it's more than a couple of weeks ago, the 470 Club arranged with the Heber Valley to buy this GP9, former B&M 1741, now Springfield Terminal 72. I hope you're all taking notes. So anyway, so it had been stored up on the New Hampshire Central for months while arrangements were made to get it down. Part of the problem is the interchange at Groveton was out of service. That was St. Lawrence and Atlantic, which is owned by G&W. They control that. So I must have heard about 13 times, you know, "Oh, that engine's going to be coming down next week." To the point where, yeah, So anyway, I knew they was getting close. They had brought the thing down to Hazen's, which is where we interchange with New Hampshire Central, which is the only way in and out. Hazen's is about 3 miles east of the ball signal at Whitefield. Nobody ever goes to the ball. That's basically done. Technically, you could go there, but in practice, you can't. Anyway, so the engine was dropped at Hazen's. They sent the 4266 up to Fabian. And I'm like, "Well, when's this supposed to happen?" They go, "Well, it might happen today. It could happen tomorrow." So I come in on a Friday and I asked our MOD, Dick, you saw the picture. I'm like, what's the story on the 66 in this engine movie? He goes, oh, it's out of Hastings. I'm like, oh, I go, well, what's the story? He goes, well, they have to meet the Mountaineer at Crawford unless somebody changes something. I'm like, right. So I got in the car and I drove up to Crawford and I walk to about where that red tree is. And I get on the radio and I'm like, I have a number. Now, we've showed you pictures of the lakeshore. I like things tied together. So now I don't use the full Boston Albany Lakeshore because that'd be too complicated. So I use the Lakeshore's number, which is 48. So if you ever hear 48 on the radio, that's me. And that's the reason. Anyway, so I go 48 to extra 4266. 4266. Oh, what is your location? They go, we're in the siding at Crawford. I go, what is your plan? They go, we're waiting to meet the Mountaineer. I'm like, thank you very much. Because I don't want to walk across that bridge if I think there's even a chance of a train coming. Despite that fact, a lot of fools do. We had an incident here 2 days later where an individual was taking pictures and slipped on the rocks and injured themselves. And our train had to rescue them, which was all over the media. And we're all really good guys by rescuing this person. Now, what people do is they walk across the bridge. Now, look, I've done all kinds of things. I know how this works. They walk across the bridge and then they scale these rocks. I've done it. I did it twice. The last time I did it going up, I'm like, I'm never going down that way again. That's crazy. I've done a lot of stupid things, but that's crazy. People do this all the time. You don't have to do that. You can trespass all over the place, walk across the bridge, walk through the rock cutting, and there's a moose trail. I don't know if it was a real moose, maybe it was a bear. Some kind of beast made this trail up the side of the hill that brings you to this location. Now, walking across the bridge is one thing, pretty stupid and might get killed, but walking up them rocks is really crazy. Anyway, so that's how you do it. I didn't give anybody permission to do anything. So later in the day, there's George Small. He's involved with the 470 Club, and he's our master carpenter, and he's got a big grin because he'd worked real hard to make all this happen, or at least assist in the happening of the engine, getting the engine where it needs to be. So there's 72 on the turntable at North Conway about 2 weeks ago. And there it is. There haven't been a lot of roster shots. I do take roster shots. There's a roster shot. Somebody might not be pleased because it's a what do you call it? A fence, a guardrail, something blocking the truck. So we'll just have to go do it again sometime. I suggested they leave this as the Guilford Rail, like heritage unit, but I think that won't happen. And 1751 is another Jeep 9 we have, and that's our regular engine on the Mountaineer. And that was taken, I don't know, about 3 weeks ago. And then I like going unusual places. I had seen this done before. It's actually not that hard to get here, but you have to know exactly how to get up there. And again, you cross the tracks and you follow this moose trail or bear trail or whatever the hell it is. And you end up here, which is just above the Gateway Shack, looking back towards the Crawford station. We are looking westbound, the train's eastbound. This was taken about 2 weeks ago. That was taken about 10 days ago. Again, that's from the top of the cut at the Gateway in Crawford. That's not particularly difficult to do. Again, you have to scale some rocks and stuff. It's not particularly dangerous. See, it's nice, safe. And a closer version of same. Nice foliage. We had great foliage this year. I didn't think it was going to happen, but it did. And another favorite spot of mine is the Willie siding, and that's the Mountaineer. Now, the funny thing is I've been riding on this train. So I rode from Crawford to Fabian and back to Crawford. Then I got off, got in my car, and I drove, and then I walked to get in here. Well, a friend of mine was traveling in the cab, and he's like, but you were just in the cab, and now you're up the side of the hill and here. So how'd that all happen? And I like the sunburst effect. The trick is F22. You shut the aperture all the way down, and it gives you this kind of starburst effect. It's just, there's no filter involved. That's just what happens when you do that. I did that with the Signal on my birthday back in 1985, and there's the same technique with digital about 3 weeks ago. And that's my last picture. And now I will attempt to answer any questions if we have time.
We got as much time.
Oh, I'm sorry. If you want to know more about the cameras, there's the short list.
Fantastic. Okay, so while we're still going out live, so keep it clean. Anybody has any questions for Brian? Shall we keep the pictures up or? Yeah.
Well, we can leave that up in case people are curious and want to take notes.
Okay. So anyway, and any questions?
Why did your parents move to Monson?
A question I must have repeated 1,000 times, and I cannot provide an answer. Now, the problem is that their answer runs contrary to my experience. I don't know. They moved there in 1973 because they wanted to get out of the city, which was Newton Center. And They wanted to own property and it was cheap, and they looked around and they ended up there. I don't really understand. Munson is, if there's the center of the universe, Munson's halfway from the center to wherever I am now. Not physically, I mean in metaphorical sense. So I guess that's the best reason. I can think of a lot of places that I'd rather live than Munson, but they're real happy there. They like it. They've got a nice old farm up on the top of a hill. You can hear the train coming up the grade. It's pastoral, it's quaint, it's quiet. I wouldn't necessarily endorse it, but they like it, so that's good.
Anybody else? Raise your hand. Daryl?
So all these photos were taken with your feet somewhere on the ground.
No, some of the pictures were actually taken from locomotive cabs.
Oh, okay. So still connected in a way to the ground. So what's your mental handling of the drone world?
I
Wider.
I don't use a drone. People have taken a lot of wonderful photos with drones. I've seen a lot of really interesting angles taken with drones. I don't have a problem with anybody else using a drone as long as it doesn't strike me while I'm doing my work. I've come close. I have some friends that have really mastered the concept of drone. You can do all sorts of angles with drones. I don't like drones for one reason, and it's a conceptual one. All the pictures you saw involved me holding a camera, and like you said, described on the ground or on a locomotive or on a signal in some cases. I'm standing on something, and I was behind the camera, so I actually witnessed the scene. The drone is some kind of abstract thing that no person actually was there to see. And I just have a problem with that. To me, it's like, well, that's all really interesting. There's some places I'd like to see drone pictures of, to see what the layout of the land and the trees and everything are. But to me, it just seems almost surreal or unreal. And it doesn't really work for me. I'd rather spend 2 hours climbing the top of a rock to look down on something than to fly something up there and back. That's just me. Like I said, there's a lot of people that make a lot of good use out of drones, but I don't want to do it.
Do you ever get frustrated?
All the time.
The last 40 years, the foliage and the trees have just wiped out. So
Yeah, and it's a running joke with my friends. I'm like, oh, there's a great shot. You go down this dirt road, you climb over here, and where'd this 40-foot tree come from? It wasn't here back in 1985. And they just kind of look at me like, oh, not again. So yeah, especially, I mean, New England's especially bad. Yeah, well, that was the first thing I think I ever said to Chris was like, that's my opinion on the trees. Just get rid of them. Someone the other day asked me, do you mind if I remove this tree? And I go, I'm not going to get in your way. And the tree may or may not be standing anymore.
Okay, anybody else?
Blue guy on the left.
And you use a tripod or monopod, or you just always handheld?
I used to use a tripod an awful lot. I own a bunch of tripods. The current one I have causes me a lot of the thing that he asked about earlier, which is frustration, because there's a picture of me using the tripod in 1997, so I've had it at least that long. And the legs aren't so bad, but the head is kind of not doing what it's supposed to. My dad's got a really nice Gitzo carbon fiber tripod, which I borrow from time to time, and Chris has got a nice tripod. So yes, I occasionally, yeah, I actually bought her the tripod. So I do use a tripod. I find that with the digital cameras, because it used to be, I shot out most of my color stuff on ISO 25 Kodachrome. You needed a tripod. And I did a lot of my black and white at night and low light, and you needed a tripod. I took pictures out here at ISO 30,000. They look really pretty good. So I don't need a tripod as much as I used to. The picture at Crawford, which was taken with my Lumix LX7, was actually my second Lumix LX7. I've had a bad luck with those things. They're great cameras. It's just don't get them really wet. Anyway, different story. So yeah, it's Lumix is there. Anyway, so yeah, that was taken on a tripod. I put the camera on that difficult tripod, and it does wonderful night pictures. I think I set it for about 30 seconds, and it just kind of did its own thing. But you couldn't take a picture like that without a tripod. So if you want pictures with stars and different types of things happening, a tripod's a good thing. The real reason I used a tripod for many, many years was discipline. And by forcing, something bad happen? No. Oh, okay. So I was disciplined. It forces you to look at the scene. It forces you to stop and not just be jumping around all over the place, but to stop and look at the scene. Because one of the things I found when I was younger is, despite my best efforts to draw an X, and whatever it is I was looking at was right smack dead in the middle of the picture. That drives me crazy, especially when I look at the older pictures. They're nice compositions, but I needed a little more discipline, and the tripod gave me the discipline. I would recommend that every photographer takes all their pictures for at least 10 years on a tripod. If they don't like that, that's not my problem. I might be joking, but I might not be. You had a question over here.
You said you developed some of your own film. Was it just black and white, or black and white and color as well?
All the pictures you saw here, the color would have been processed commercially. Now, that said, I ran a commercial color lab. I actually ran several color labs. So yes, I actually did process some of my own film, but it went through the same mix as everybody else's. I know how to process E6. I've never processed Kodachrome, but all the Kodachrome would be commercial. Generally speaking, there's no advantage in processing your own E6 unless you happen to be running the lab. Color film needs to be processed to a very specific formula to get it to do what it needs to do. Varying from that will not improve your result. Black and white, because you can get a number of different types of tonality, and you can push the film, not in a stop pushing. You can expand the film's tonal range and get it to do different types of contrast and tonality, and you can do all kinds of stuff with black and white film by manipulating the process. I usually don't. Are we still live on the internet? I don't like to tell people this, but I actually have a patent on a photographic process, but nothing to do with photography. So I know a lot about the nuts and bolts of how the silver halides work, which is one of the problems I have with digital photography. I don't have a clue as how it actually works. I mean, on a basic conceptual level I do, but in the real nuts and bolts molecular level, I don't. The silver photography, I really truly understand that. I've got a grip on that after 50 years. I think I probably know a lot about it. I've actually made my own emulsion. I actually started, they're not in this pile picture because it didn't fit any of the big projects, but back in 1987, I actually made my own emulsion from egg whites and silver nitrate. And I made my own emulsion. So I understand how to put all the pieces together and push that to the ultimate limit. The same way, I mean, I see kind of what I'm doing, and you'll see a play on words here. If you know a little bit about Led Zeppelin, which is one of my favorite bands, Jimmy Page applied the same sort of level of understanding of music to doing what he did with Led Zeppelin as a band is to what I'm doing here. And I see a kind of a parallel in that he made his own guitar at one point and, really thoroughly understood how music worked, right? So taking that as an example, the more I can know about how photography works, and the more I know about how my subject works, the railroad, I find that improves my pictures. I know a lot of people out there just take pictures of trains, and I'm not condemning that or criticizing it. I know a lot of my friends do that. I want to know as much as I can. I want to know who's running the engine. I want to know who the division superintendent is. I want to know, how heavy the rail is. I want to know what signaling system they want. I want to know everything about the railroad. That helps when you're writing books too, but I want to know all that. And I write it all down. I even have a notebook here. I even carry a camera. You might have known taking a picture out the back. Well, are those pictures going to be in the next program? I don't know. I haven't actually looked at them yet, but they're probably all right. Right. So, but I'm always taking pictures, and I look at every picture as a step to the next picture. So the reason I call these the big projects, there's a lot of small projects. There's things that I did once, and not to say the pictures aren't bad, but I didn't put the level of work into the small project that I did into the big project. The big projects, I lash at for days and weeks and years and decades, and I take them with digital and black and white and film. I do it in day and night. I kind of study it and learn about it and decide I'm not happy with it and do it all over again. And sometimes the pictures you like were the ones you actually did the first time around. And sometimes it's the ones that you spent 10 years on. And I found that when you first see something, or when I first see something, you will see it in a way that you will never see again. Because once you've seen something the first time, and then you see it again and again, you start to change it. It's sort of like you're filling in the gaps. But if you see it too much, you might actually miss what you saw the first time around. And I think that's a key thing, because the person who's seeing something once is going to see it in a way that someone who sees it every day doesn't see. So those early pictures of whatever it is, be it Donner Pass or Ireland or whatever, are going to be different from the ones that happen after that. So, and that's something I can't do with the Boston and Albany, because I've been seeing the Boston and Albany since I could stand up. But I look at the early pictures, And they have something that the later ones don't, which sometimes frustrates me. You get back to the frustration thing. I get frustrated sometimes when I look at pictures that I took when I was 10. And I'm like, hey, I can't do that now. I don't know what I was doing when I was 10, but it was just strictly raw. I was just a 10-year-old kid with a camera. There's only 3 controls: focus, aperture, and shutter speed. That was it, right? There's only 3 controls. Now all these digital cameras, they got all kinds of menus and scrolls, and you can adjust everything and all this stuff. All I did was I had a Leica and I had to get it focused right. You miss the focus, it's all over. The rest of it, you could work with it. Miss the focus, it was all, well, actually, that's not entirely true, but we don't have time for that today. But those pictures I took when I was a kid, first of all, everything has changed, right? I mean, it's just like there's nothing there then that's there now. Ireland is like that. Just nothing that was there in 1998 that looks that way now. Well, except possibly Ross Craig Cabin, but I haven't been there in a while. It may be changed too. So I always take everything and I keep everything. Now, finding it's another story. I figure I've probably taken about 350,000 film photos, plus or minus 100,000. I'm not really good with math. The digital stuff, I don't even want to hazard a guess, because the problem with the digital is you can just keep snapping away and filling the hard drives. I probably have 40 2-terabyte hard drives or equivalent. I have a lot of hard drives because I believe in storing everything multiple times in multiple locations, in multiple countries, in multiple formats. The only reason you saw the program tonight is I saved it on 2 different sticks, 2 different ways, so that when the first one didn't work, the second one did, because I know how these things work, in that whatever you thought you did won't work when you need it to. Any other question back there?
Yeah, with your digital shooting, do you use any type of post-processing?
Everything is post-processed. Yeah, I shoot.
Do you use like Lightroom?
I primarily use whatever the most current Lightroom that came with my laptop. I don't know if it's totally up to date. I'm not really a technology guy. These computer things alarm me, but I'm more of an old school. But yeah, no, the digital has to be post-processed, in my opinion, to get out of it. Like I've got this Nikon Z6, or they'd say Z6 in the UK, right? So that there's so much data that sensor is capturing, and whoever manufactured the camera, they don't know what I want to do with that data. So there's a JPEG the camera outputs, and you can play with that a whole bunch of different ways, but that's just an interpretation. And the JPEG, sometimes it's exactly what I want. It's ready, it's all set, there you go. But for a lot of this stuff, especially if it's going into print, it has to be manipulated. That's just part of the process.
You probably shoot raw and then post-process.
I shoot raw and JPEG of everything.
Yeah.
And then I post-process. The same way with the black and white film. I'd process the film and then I'd make prints.
Because I find in my thing with digital that there's a lot of interesting techniques you can do with Lightroom that you did with your product.
Okay. Okay, I'm told we need to conclude this. I'll take one more quick question. You had a question over here?
Sorry.
Considering the time you spent on Ireland, did you ride most of the Irish railway network?
Most of it. Most of the network that was available to ride. I've never traveled from Mullingar to Athlone, because every time they ran a train on that line, which was a couple of times, I opted to photograph it instead of ride it, which I still regret, but I did get some nice pictures. But I got most of the rest of it that was available to me at the time. Any other quick questions?
Do you ever have goals of getting certain subjects, and
Yes.
suddenly somebody else, one of your compatriots, gets that, aces it, and
Sometimes, like I said, with the Steinheimer picture, I mean, I came to California, Steinheimer had been taking pictures probably for 50 years at that stage, probably more than that, actually. So, yeah, there's sometimes where I see a picture, I'm like, oh yeah, I like to do that. But I want to take it beyond. I don't need to replicate what somebody else has already done. I want to take it to another level, right? So if you look at a lot of the pictures I have in the Boston Albee, they're not standard kind of angles. I mean, some of them are, but a lot of times I want to do something that's different. I don't need to do what everyone else has already done. So when everyone else is off running this direction, I'm going the other way. You had a question here?
Oh, very quickly, there was a railman, Joel Solomon, any relation?
No, I don't know him.
And
No.
there was I knew of Monty Solomon and Cambridge in the 1990s.
No, no relation. My dad's Richard J. Solomon, and he still takes pictures. He brought me all over the place, but that's the only Solomon I'm related to, and my brother.
Traffic light signal in Huntington was done as an experiment, and they ran tests. That was what I was told.
Okay,
In 1976, 82 era.
okay, I
And
believe
was
that.
what you concluded, that motorists are trained to obey red lights.
Well, the problem is, and I've done a lot on grade crossing safety, and we're gonna run down that garden path, so I'll make it really quick, is the problem is that a flashing red light to a motorist is a stop and proceed, while a hard red light is a stop and stay. And because we use flashing red lights, people think it's okay to go through them.
Yeah.
And they think incorrectly, and a certain portion of them only think that once.
Yeah.
Right? And this is a huge problem, because if you allow the motorist to make the correct decision, a certain portion of them won't.
Yeah,
And the results are bad.
very quickly, the old swaying stop sign.
The
that
wigwag.
was Wigwag, one of the problems was that people would occasionally treat that as a stop sign.
Well, where the wigwag, where the grade crossing flasher comes from is a literal interpretation of the wigwag. So the wigwag with the red lights going like this, the grade crossing flasher, which came much, much later, like 20 years later, is to mimic the effect of the wigwag. I watched in real time the flaw of a wigwag in Wisconsin once, where the wigwag's there ringing, the bell's ringing, the thing's flapping back and forth, and this woman in the car rolls right in front of the train as if there's nothing, never probably even knew she did anything wrong. And I'm like, I love wigwags, but they just don't work.
Yeah. Okay, I think we need to stop the live stream.
Okay.
So I just want to thank Brian for a fascinating program. And not only is photography amazing, but Brian's a great storyteller too. And I'm sure we could stand here and tell stories all night, but Brian and Chris have a big day tomorrow, sightseeing in Boston.
We're going to the aquarium.
So anyway, thank you so much. For those of you who are watching live stream, I'm sorry things were kind of choppy, but this ain't big time productions. And so anyway, thanks to everybody. And we'll end the live stream now if I can